Most people picture English longbowmen the way movies show them, calm lines of archers firing perfect volleys into the sky. But the real longbow battlefield looked nothing like that. These weren't background characters. They were highly trained soldiers who shaped entire medieval campaigns. Their weapons demanded enormous physical strength. Their tactics relied on terrain and weather, and their role extended far beyond simply shooting arrows. To understand how the English actually won battles like Crécy and Agincourt, you have to look past Hollywood and see how longbows were truly used in the chaos, pressure, and strategy of real medieval warfare. Number 1. The way longbowmen really trained. English longbowmen were not casual recruits who picked up a bow a few weeks before a battle. Their entire bodies were shaped around this weapon from childhood because the longbow demanded a level of strength and endurance that ordinary men simply didn't have. A proper warbow drew anywhere from 120 to 160 pounds of force-far beyond anything used in modern recreational archery. Pulling that weight repeatedly didn't just build muscle, it altered bones. Archaeologists studying skeletons from the Mary Rose, Henry VIII's warship, found enlarged left arms, rotated shoulder sockets, thickened fingers, and spines twisted from years of drawing the bow. These weren't deformities. They were the physical signatures of a lifetime spent mastering a single tool. Training wasn't symbolic, ceremonial, or designed for show. It was mandatory. English law required boys from age 7 onward to practice every Sunday and on holidays. Village fields had targets placed deliberately far apart, so young archers learned distance first and accuracy second. The goal was to build a natural feel for trajectory long before they worried about perfect grouping. They didn't fire elegant movie-style shots. They fired hundreds every day, thousands every year, until knocking, drawing, and releasing became reflex. Their hands developed thick calluses, and their joints adapted to constant strain. The motion that looks so effortless in reenactments was actually the result of lifelong repetition. Speed mattered as much as strength. Real longbowmen were trained to shoot fast, 10 to 12 arrows per minute in a sustained rhythm. That level of output turned a single unit into a storm of projectiles, and they trained to maintain this pace in the worst conditions imaginable: rain, fog, mud, freezing winds, hunger, exhaustion. None of that mattered on a battlefield. If a boy couldn't fire under stress, he couldn't serve. By adulthood, a longbowman's body was a weapon in itself, conditioned to push through burning shoulders and aching fingers. He didn't pause for dramatic tension. He kept shooting until his commander told him to stop. The discipline behind this skill was strict. Archers drilled in judging distance by sight, by sound, and even by how wind pressed against their clothing. They learned to adjust their aim instantly because there were no rangefinders, no sighting aids, no mechanical supports. Everything depended on instinct honed through repetition. And while movies show archers firing in clean open fields, real practice often happened in cluttered environments between trees, over uneven ground, or in shifting crowds. Archers learned to move their feet, reposition their bodies, and maintain accuracy while walking. Their teachers weren't trying to create beautiful archery. They were creating reliable warfighters who could reshape a battlefield with raw volume of fire. This lifelong commitment made longbowmen some of the most valuable soldiers in medieval Europe. They weren't nobles, but they held a strange prestige. Their strength, endurance, and skill set them apart. And commanders knew that once battle began, these men wouldn't freeze, hesitate, or wait for perfect alignment. They would unleash continuous volleys that collapsed morale, disrupted formations, and turned the momentum of war long before swords even crossed. The longbow wasn't a prop, it was a brutal instrument that demanded relentless dedication from the moment a boy first lifted it. Number 2. Why longbowmen didn't stand still like in movies. The clean, tidy rows of synchronized archers seen in films create great visuals, but they completely misrepresent how longbowmen actually moved in combat. Medieval battlefields were chaotic, muddy, uneven, crowded, and unpredictable. No commander wanted his archers standing in neat, vulnerable lines, waiting to be run over by cavalry. Instead, they were placed where mobility and cover mattered. They stood on slopes to increase shooting distance, on the flanks to angle shots into enemy formations, behind sharpened stakes to stop cavalry, or inside muddy terrain that sabotaged enemy charges. When the fighting started, archers constantly adjusted their footing. They stepped forward or backward to find better angles, sidestepped wounded comrades, and repositioned to dodge incoming arrows or crossbow bolts. They were more like fast-moving artillery crews than static firing squads. Their ability to adapt was crucial. If cavalry shifted direction, archers rotated. If infantry pressed one side harder, archers concentrated fire there. They shouted distances, wind changes, and commands, creating a rough but effective communication network across their line. They also didn't fire at the same angle the whole time. Long-range volleys required high arcs that sent arrows raining from above, but as enemies advanced, archers lowered their bows, delivering more direct and powerful shots. This wasn't done in clean stages. It was continuous adjustment. Experienced archers understood how the battlefield's shape changed from minute to minute, and they modified their behavior accordingly. Once enemies closed in, archers didn't simply stand and reload. They pivoted, fell back, or switched weapons. Longbowmen carried short swords, bucklers, and mauls for close combat. They weren't fragile or helpless. Many were more muscular than knights because of the physical demands of drawing heavy bows. If a line collapsed, archers could quickly form a defensive cluster behind stakes or retreat to another position to continue firing at steep angles over their own infantry. Commanders also intentionally staggered archer lines rather than keeping them straight. A curved or angled formation allowed overlapping fields of fire, which could shred enemy units traveling through narrow gaps or choke points. Terrain dictated everything. Archers used hedges, ditches, wagon barriers, and even fallen trees for protection. At Agincourt, the muddy field and wooden stakes forced French cavalry into a funnel that made them easy targets. At Crécy, slopes gave English archers the range advantage they needed to break Genoese crossbow lines. Movies skip the tactical reality. Archers survived because they stayed mobile, used terrain intelligently, and refused to become easy targets. Their value came from flexibility and reaction speed, not from standing in place hoping accuracy alone would win the day. Medieval commanders built entire battle plans around their movement, not around aesthetic firing lines. Number 3, the arrows that movies never show. Popular media often treats arrows like lightweight props that barely do more than annoy armored knights. But English war arrows were built for destruction. Longbowmen carried multiple arrow types because each served a different purpose on the battlefield. Against armored opponents, the bodkin point was the star narrow, hardened, and shaped like a chisel or square spike. These heads didn't slice, they punched. They were engineered to slip into weak spots between metal plates, crack mail links, and penetrate padding with shocking force when fired at closer ranges. For horses, archers switched to broadheads with razor-wide cutting edges. These could slice arteries, sever muscle, and bring down a charging mount instantly, which mattered because a fallen horse could roll and crush its rider, creating chaos that rippled through an entire cavalry wing. Against unarmored infantry, longbowmen used lighter arrows that flew faster and deeper. They were easier to mass-produce, making them ideal for overwhelming enemy lines in large volleys. Archers carried dozens of arrows into battle, but that barely covered the opening stages. Supply carts followed behind, stacked with thousands more. Runners distributed bundles to replace spent quivers, because archers were expected to keep firing until commanded otherwise. This supply chain turned archery into a continuous pressure tool, not a one-time opening strike. Real arrows hit with tremendous speed and force. At short to mid-range, a war arrow could penetrate shields, shatter bones, or pierce helmets. The sound of battle wasn't just clashing swords, it was the heavy drum of arrows slamming into armor and wood. Shields filled with shafts became hard to maneuver. Helmets rang like bells when bodkins struck. Horses screamed and stumbled. Infantry waded through mud mixed with broken arrows, which slowed advances and made formations clumsy. Psychological damage was as important as physical wounds. Soldiers hesitated under a rain of arrows, raising shields that blocked their vision and broke formation cohesion. Cavalry struggled to maintain speed when arrows hit horses, or when terrain clogged with arrow shafts disrupted footing. Even when arrows didn't kill, they disrupted, delayed, distracted, and exhausted. That disruption was the real power of the longbow. Movies rarely capture how arrows transformed the battlefield into a hazardous landscape. Broken shafts became obstacles. Wounded soldiers fell and blocked the path. Horses collapsing in front ranks created piles that halted entire charges. Archers didn't need to kill everyone, they only needed to break momentum. And that's exactly what these heavy, purpose-built war arrows were designed to do. Number 4. How commanders actually used longbows in battle. English commanders treated longbowmen as the backbone of their battlefield strategy. These weren't support units tucked into corners. They were the primary tool for shaping the enemy's approach. The longbow was medieval long-range artillery, used to weaken, slow, and disorganize foes before melee troops even touched them. Commanders selected terrain carefully. A hill amplified range. A muddy field destroyed cavalry speed. A narrow valley forced enemies into a choke point. Stakes and pits added layers of protection against charges. Everything was engineered so archers could fire as long as possible without being overrun. A well-placed archer line could break half an army before swords ever clashed. Longbow volleys served multiple tactical purposes. Early volleys forced knights to raise shields, breaking their visual coordination. Sustained fire exhausted soldiers who needed to fight their way forward under constant pressure. Arrows targeted horses, not because horses were the main enemy, but because a collapsed cavalry wing left infantry exposed and confused. When infantry finally reached English lines, they were gasping, covered in wounds, and no longer in tight ranks. Commanders also knew that archers couldn't maintain maximum output forever. They rotated lines, letting one group loose heavy volleys while another rested their shoulders for a moment. They timed broader volleys to disrupt advances or force regrouping. Experienced leaders understood wind patterns and ordered archers to shift direction to optimize impact. They saved certain arrowheads for specific threats, using bodkins when armored units pressed too close. The longbow wasn't a background tool, it was central. At Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, the longbow didn't simply support the infantry, it dictated the entire flow of combat. Even once melee began, archers didn't vanish. They repositioned behind or beside infantry and continued firing at high angles so arrows would drop onto enemy formations without hitting their own troops. Some units even moved to flank positions during melee to continue disrupting enemy cohesion. Commanders relied on archers to do more than inflict casualties. They relied on them to control the enemy's attention. A steady rain of arrows forced opponents to focus upward and forward at the same time, splitting their awareness. That constant pressure made enemy units slow, hesitate, or turn, giving English infantry and men-at-arms openings that wouldn't exist otherwise. The real genius of English battlefield strategy was not the longbow itself, but how intelligently it was used. The weapon's power came from coordination, terrain mastery, psychological pressure, and relentless sustained fire. Movies focus on heroic charges and flashy sword fights, but medieval victories were often decided long before those clashes, shaped by archers who stood on muddy slopes, firing until their arms shook, turning entire armies into disorganized shadows of their former strength. Number 5. The real close combat role of longbowmen. Longbowmen never had the luxury of assuming they would stay at a safe distance throughout a battle. Once the enemy pushed through volleys of arrows, the archers needed to survive whatever happened next. That meant their training included more than just shooting. They learned how to fight in tight, messy situations where everything was up close, loud, and unpredictable. Their primary weapon in close combat wasn't the bow, it was whatever short tool they could swing quickly without losing balance. Many carried falchions, compact axes, or heavy mallets designed to deliver fast, stunning blows rather than elegant sword moves. Some battles even mention longbowmen carrying simple wooden cudgels because they were cheap, durable, and easy to swing in crowded spaces. Alongside these weapons, they used bucklers, small round shields, perfect for deflecting a strike or creating a split-second opening to counterattack. These shields weren't for blocking powerful knightly blows. They were for quick reactions, helping archers stay alive long enough for infantry to join in. Archers didn't fight as solo heroes. They stuck together, forming small groups that moved as one when enemies reached their lines. Working together allowed them to harass armored knights, trip opponents, or target weak spots in armor. Their goal wasn't to dominate the enemy in a duel, but to disrupt, distract, and delay them. When a knight stumbled in mud, or struggled to rise after slipping on bodies or broken gear, archers swarmed to exploit the moment. They didn't try to overpower the knight directly. They tried to unbalance him, drag him down, or incapacitate him by cutting straps or striking exposed areas. The battlefield wasn't a place of honor-driven one-on-one fights. It was a place where survival meant working fast and working together. Terrain traps played a major part in how longbowmen managed close combat. English commanders often prepared the ground ahead of time by placing sharpened stakes, digging shallow pits, and using natural mud to create hazards. When heavy cavalry or infantry reached these zones, their formation broke apart. That was exactly when longbowmen charged in from the flanks or behind the stakes, using their mobility as an advantage. They weren't protected in plate armor, so the last thing they wanted was a long confrontation. Quick, targeted strikes and coordinated pushes had far better results. They often battered knights who couldn't move their arms freely in tight conditions, forcing them onto the ground where they were vulnerable. While movies show knights as invincible tanks, real medieval combat proved that fallen armored soldiers were some of the easiest targets on the field. Archers understood this reality. They weren't ashamed to swarm a single knight. Victory and survival mattered more than honor. Many longbowmen also carried knives designed for a brutal but effective purpose, slipping into gaps in armor where even bodkin arrows had limited reach. These knives allowed archers to finish fights quickly once a knight's balance or visibility was compromised. They weren't duelists, they were practical fighters who knew how to make the most of a chaotic environment. And because their close combat role is so rarely acknowledged in modern portrayals, many people underestimate how essential they were, not just before the clash, but during it. They were the connective tissue between ranged harassment and infantry pressure. When the front lines collapsed into a single mass of bodies, longbowmen didn't retreat to safety. They fought in the thick of the confusion, proving that archer in medieval warfare meant much more than standing far away and shooting arrows. Their strength came from endurance, teamwork, and a grounded understanding of real combat. They weren't trying to look heroic. They were trying to stay alive. Every part of their battle role blended together. Shooting, repositioning, trapping, delaying, and then fighting hand to hand when the enemy finally got close. That combination made them far more versatile than the clean, distant archers shown in movies. They were adaptable warriors who contributed to every phase of the battle and helped shape outcomes long after their last arrow had been fired. Number 6. Weather, terrain, and why English longbows dominated. The power of the longbow didn't come solely from how it was built. What truly set English longbow warfare apart was how intelligently it used the environment. Longbowmen read the terrain the way sailors read the ocean. Hills, mud, wind direction, slopes, tree lines, ditches. Every one of these mattered. English commanders chose battlefields strategically whenever possible, forcing enemies into conditions that weakened them while maximizing the archers' strengths. A perfect example is muddy terrain. Heavy cavalry, especially French knights, needed solid ground for speed and impact. On soft, wet fields, their horses lost footing and momentum. English archers, lighter and more mobile, moved across the same ground with far less difficulty. When arrows began falling and cavalry tried to charge through mud, the knights found themselves fighting both the English and the earth beneath their feet. That combination made the longbow far more destructive. Elevation was another critical factor. Placing archers on hills allowed arrows to travel farther and hit harder. Gravity turned every descending arrow into a deadlier projectile. At battles like Crécy, English archers fired from elevated ground, giving their shots extra penetrating power and forcing enemies to advance uphill under constant pressure. No knight, no matter how well armored, enjoyed climbing a slope while dodging volleys that seemed to fall endlessly from above. In narrow terrain, such as choke points or natural funnels, archers became even more dangerous. When enemies had limited room to spread out, every arrow had a higher chance of hitting someone. English commanders deliberately positioned archers to exploit these narrow paths, turning movement into a liability for the opposing army. Wind mattered more than most people think. Longbowmen paid close attention to gusts and changes in air pressure. Shooting against the wind meant adjusting draw strength and arrow angle to maintain distance and accuracy. Shooting with the wind allowed archers to create wider arrow spreads, a useful tactic against large infantry blocks that marched tightly together. English armies trained their longbow units to adapt quickly when wind shifted mid-battle. That ability to adjust aim on the fly gave them a serious advantage over less flexible missile troops. Weather conditions also separated longbows from crossbows. Crossbow strings loosened or slipped in the rain, reducing power dramatically. Longbows, by contrast, remained usable as long as archers kept their strings dry. Many carried spare strings protected under hats, cloaks, or small pouches. When rain soaked the battlefield, longbowmen simply swapped strings and kept shooting while crossbow units struggled. This difference played a role in multiple English victories, where sudden storms turned the environment into an ally for the longbow. Woodlands, hedges, and other natural covers became defensive tools. English archers often positioned themselves partly within tree lines so cavalry couldn't easily reach them. Horses avoided dense vegetation, and knights risked losing momentum or control if they charged directly into it. Archers used these obstacles to protect flanks or create safe fallback zones. They didn't rely on flat, open fields. They used every inch of the landscape to create choke points, force redirection, or buy time for infantry. What movies rarely show is how deliberately planned these setups were. English commanders didn't approach battles hoping the longbow would magically solve everything. They studied the environment, shaped the battlefield, and let the longbow amplify the advantages they created. In real medieval warfare, terrain and weather weren't background decor, they were weapons. The longbow's effectiveness came from being paired with smart positioning, environmental awareness, and well-practiced adaptability. That combination turned ordinary landscapes into strategic traps and turned simple wooden bows into war-winning tools. Number 7. The real battlefield chaos movies don't show. The real environment of a medieval battlefield involving longbows was nothing like the clean, elegant scenes shown in films. Arrows didn't glide softly through the air. They hissed, cracked, splintered, and punched into armor with violent force. The soundtrack of battle included the metallic clatter of arrowheads striking helmets, the wet thud of shafts hitting unarmored men, and the deafening screams of wounded soldiers and horses. Dust filled the air, mixed with smoke from fires, creating a haze that made it impossible to see more than a few yards clearly. Nothing about it was calm or organized. Archers slipped on mud or tripped over fallen bodies as they tried to maintain firing speed. Quivers emptied quickly, forcing many to scavenge arrows from the ground, even ones covered in mud or lodged in shields. Communication was almost impossible once volleys began. Commanders shouted orders, but wind, screaming, and the clash of melee meant only fragments of those orders reached the archers. Units adapted independently, reacting to immediate threats rather than waiting for perfect instructions. When visibility dropped, archers judged distance by sound, listening for cavalry hooves, shield impacts, or the roar of approaching infantry. They fired at shadows, silhouettes, or dense clusters of movement, trusting their instincts and training to guide shots. As melee broke out, archers operated in extreme proximity to chaos. They felt the ground shake from cavalry impacts, heard armor rattling inches away, and saw men collapse under the weight of repeated strikes. They fought exhaustion as much as the enemy. Drawing a 150-pound bow again and again drained every muscle in the shoulders, back, and arms. After hours of shooting, many archers felt their fingers loose feeling and their vision blur from strain and smoke. Yet they kept going because stopping meant enemy forces breaking through. Shields quickly became nearly useless because arrows embedded so deeply that soldiers struggled to lift them. Horses panicked, spinning wildly, or crashing into friendly troops. Knights who fell created new obstacles. Heavy armor made them difficult to move, so bodies accumulated into heaps that altered the shape of the battlefield. Those piles became hazards that slowed or redirected movement, forcing both sides to fight in disorganized, unpredictable ways. Longbowmen had to adjust constantly, stepping over debris, jumping back from collapsing horses, or dodging retreating infantry. The ground itself turned into a dangerous landscape. Broken arrows formed jagged carpets capable of piercing boots. Mud mixed with blood to create slippery patches. Every step required awareness, because one misstep could mean getting trapped beneath a collapsing formation or losing balance just as an enemy closed in. Archers fought not only the enemy, but also the battlefield conditions themselves. Despite all this, longbowmen maintained a relentless rhythm. Their ability to keep firing under sensory overload separated them from less experienced missile troops. They weren't detached observers. They were in the heart of the battle's noise, violence, and confusion. They continued shooting, even as melee raged just ahead, often lofting arrows at steep angles so they wouldn't hit their own infantry. That constant pressure disrupted enemy formations even after initial volleys ended. The longbow wasn't a graceful cinematic flourish. It was a hard-working battlefield tool wielded by men who endured hours of fear, exhaustion, and chaos. Real medieval warfare with the longbow was defined by noise, grit, improvisation, and relentless pressure. The movies show archers as calm, distant figures firing in perfect rhythm. The truth is far more human, and far more intense archers surviving in a storm of violence, adapting every second, and shaping battles not through elegant shots, but through their resilience and unbroken determination.